Hello, everybody. Welcome into another edition of HeadCoachU. I am Bryan Fischer, joined as always by former BYU and Virginia head coach Bronco Mendenhall. And Bronco, the parade of high-profile guests continues here on the podcast. Thrilled to welcome in the general manager of the Los Angeles Rams, Snead. Les, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm jacked to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you on, and you and Bronco have a very special connection for the listeners that don't know it. Could you maybe fill us in a little bit?
The special connection would be this. I happen to probably have a teenage son who wanted and to play college football, loved football, probably very similar to a wild horse. And at the end of the day, I kind of knew his capabilities and all that. But as a GM and father, let's call it a GM in the NFL, but more importantly, a father, I was like, I really don't care. And my son's name was Logan, if he plays a down of football. But fortunately, sitting in the seat that I sit in, you got to view a lot of college football programs from 30,000 feet. And probably even before I ever met Bronco or chatted with Bronco, even when he was at BYU, really respected, right, how he engineered his football program and really how that program then engineered let's call it young teenage boys to men, I call it. So that would be the connection. If there was one person that I would say, I don't want to put it down to one, but I know this, Bronco was the one that I chose, and he was definitely in the top five of like, if you're going to send your son, not necessarily to help you win games, Bronco, really it was selfish on my part, send my son to be developed by Bronco and his staff and his program.
So it was an absolute privilege. And so I got to work with Logan, and what an amazing young man. And through Logan, I actually got to know Les and Les's wife better, and just had a great book recommendation from Les's wife, by the way, which was awesome. But then I went to the Senior Bowl one time, and Les and I crossed paths, and there was just an immediate connection on learning and organizational design and purpose. And the conversation went, yeah, it surrounded football, but it really wasn't about football. It was about things kind of more of substance. And so it was
I remember chatting with you, Bronco, on the field, and I wish I remember who it was, but I know someone at the Senior Bowl on the field that day. Might have been someone on your staff at Virginia, might have been just someone that knew both of us, but at the end of the day said, hey, you ought to go introduce yourself to Bronco. Maybe that gentleman, whomever introduced us. But the connection was, I think it started with probably Jim Collins' Good to Great book. And it was like, oh, you got to meet Bronco Mendenhall. And but I wish I knew who that.
Yeah, I don't
it was, but someone at the Senior Bowl, they said, you need to go introduce yourself to Bronco ASAP because you two, y'all think very similarly.
I remember, and I don't remember who it was, but I remember the immediate impression of authenticity and learning and inquiry and curiosity coming from a general manager of an NFL team, which captivated me, right? There's plenty of ego in our businesses, and there's plenty of people that have answers or proclaim they have answers. And I'm always captivated by those that are curious and inquisitive and humble, but also, right, that usually reflects intelligence and this cutting edge desire to keep. I recognized that right off, and I was like, oh man, this guy. I remember calling Holly after and said, yeah, I just found a really a new friend and a great connection, and that's what it's been. And so I was able to go visit Les and watch the Rams practice at least one day last fall, if I remember right. I was visiting a few other places, and I have a former player that was with the Rams at that time, Bryce Perkins. And so I had a chance to see him as well, which is always just so much fun. And so it was fun just to see the Rams organization a little bit more from inside out and to watch the operation. And I think a lot of Sean McVay, the coach of the Rams. And so it was really fun to watch him lead a practice. And so anyway, as it comes to this time of year and so many, I don't know, the draft, right? And here was the Senior Bowl and the combines coming up, and general managers all over the country are at their work. But I thought it'd be great and I asked Les this offline, but Man, I think it'd be great for our listeners just to get an idea of what a general manager does, and it might be different amongst organizations. But man, if you could give just an overview of, man, how does the organization run, and what are you responsible for?
Just for the audience, I think Bronco hit the nail on the head. At this point in time, the majority of a general manager's day is going to be working with the head coach, his staff, probably the scouting staff, and we're really preparing probably a big picture vision of what's our vision for the roster uh, in 2023, and then how do we utilize the draft and let's call it trades, free agency to build that roster. So that's going to be predominantly from the time we walk in this building until the time we leave. It's going to be some element of discussing big picture vision of the roster, and then how do we bring that to life. The general manager and head coach, predominantly in NFL, we're not responsible for the business side. We're not selling tickets or things like that. Yes, sponsorships is going to use us at times, just as I'm sure in college football, right? You're going to have to do some things to meet with donors or sponsors or things like that. But at the end of the day, we do try to say, okay, how do we carve out our days where the main thing is the main thing, and that's what is our vision for the Rams in the short and long term, 2023. Bronco, you're a coach. You've been, but a lot of times, hey, with coaches, they're more microscopic than telescopic. So
Yeah.
it's 2023, and then hey, we'll figure out 24 when it gets there. But we're basically at that point going, okay, what's our vision? And this time of year, we're predominantly trying to bring that vision to life into Sean and his staff are obviously working on schemes, staying ahead of the curve in terms of tactics, and myself is bridging and let's call it helping us collaborate, our scouting staff, Sean, his coaching staff, to build and engineer our roster, whether it's through the draft. We're spending a lot of time right now preparing for the draft, and obviously there's other mechanisms in free agency, trades and things like that.
I mean, we're speaking right before the NFL Combine, and that's obviously a lot of your attention in terms of that incoming crop of potential draftees. And how busy is this time, especially before kind of that pro day circuit starts, and you're flying all over the country? And ultimately, when you go to an event like the Combine, what are you kind of searching for when you're looking for guys and having a lot of those meetings with players that we don't see on the outside, but I know is very impactful to the process in terms of evaluation for you?
Really, because because we're going to probably really prepare for, at this time of year, probably 300 plus players, and probably somehow whittle that down based on intangible, based on fit of scheme, uh, so probably somewhere between 100 and 150 that are on the draft board. And then of that 100 150, there's really at that point probably 25 to 30 to 40 that are like who we really want, and also the geography of the draft, right? It's not all the best players because you're not going to be able to get those. So I think it's case by case efficiency on uh, how do we use each step of the how do we use the all-star game, how do we use the combine, the pro day circuit, hey, bringing kids in, going to see them. So we're not gonna cookie cut it and use every one of those platforms in the same way. It's really trying to go, okay, if we do go there, if we spend time there with a player, what do we really need to come away from? So some of that might be, in a very simple sense, seeing a running back who primarily ran the ball in college, but how does he run the routes we like our running backs to run, and how does he catch, right? Because you might not see that, and it also might be, okay, let's see what the player's football acumen is. Okay, how does that player keep on the running back team? How does that player process the information, able to, let's call it, pick up blitzes and things like that.
So when you consider and you're building your roster again, and I know the draft is probably preeminent right now on your mind, does that follow in sequence of free agency and trades and then the draft? Do those things all kind of happen sequentially or at the same time, intermixed? Like, what does that sequencing look like traditionally?
Traditionally, and a lot of people would probably complain about this, traditionally the draft comes after free agency. So free agency has evolved a little bit because free agency starts in March, uh, and free agency still can be going on during the draft in terms of there is this element when the bell rings. If you're watching ESPN, NFL Network, what have you, there's going to be this frenzy for about a week of players whose contract expired and maybe they change teams or re-sign with their current teams, and usually those are the bigger investments financially. Then there's going to be a settling phase where players may not get what they wanted. Maybe there's players that are going to, they're in their third and fourth contract, so they're not, let's call it, getting long-term hefty and contracts. It's more going to be 1 year, 2 year type deals, and they're going to specifically wait and see which teams they may want to go to based on the chance of winning, things like that. So it's all going to kind of mesh together there at the end. But traditionally, free agency comes before the draft, and probably the bigger trades come before the draft. There is a trade deadline during the season, but that's a little. I mean, we saw Christian McCaffrey leave the Panthers to go to the Niners, and we're seeing that in the NFL a little more than usual. But that's the sequence.
Yeah. So in relation to the sequence as well, when you're considering someone free agency wise, or maybe even a trade, and I know you're looking hard at your organization and your culture, and I'm sure there's all kinds of extensive work on the fit. How much of it is, besides the ability component and their capability to do the job on the field, how much do you get into the cultural part on just will they fit within your organization? I guess maybe how much weight is placed on that in your organization or maybe others?
I think I think probably like a lot of sports, you probably start with the physical, and at the end of the day, then every let's call it pool or pot of players that are possibility to be Rams, we're going to discuss right what football skills they have and how and why those skills help us. Now, after that's the base rate.
That's right.
And the other part now becomes very important in, again, the intangibles of that player. So it gets into two, right? If you're a more veteran player, right, it's probably going to be different than a young kid in the draft where, okay, there's going to be an element of development, either physically or even from a maturity standpoint. So you're going to weigh both of those, but intangibles, right? And I always say this, to keep it simple: Mom, Dad, God gave us some version of physical talent. Usually there's some type of athletic traits to play football. Then you, in the algorithm or the calculus formula, you add together maybe that player's ability to process information and adjust quickly. So it doesn't mean that player has to be an all A student or what have you, but wow, he was blessed and wired genetically or what have you to be able to absorb some information, process it quickly. Then you add together the natural intangibles, the conscientiousness, and all of that's going to equal a useful skill. So we've all seen the person who's really, really blessed, but didn't necessarily work to bring that talent to fruition, and maybe was less skilled on the football field. So that's very important. And Bronco, going to culture, we do think we have a living culture that's going to change probably a little bit daily, but shouldn't change a lot. And it's going to definitely change yearly based on who you bring in. So a lot of times there may be someone, let's say, that let's call it a rectangle instead of a square in our culture. We will weigh, hey, is our culture strong enough to absorb that person's personality fit and doesn't necessarily negatively affect ours. But if we do determine that it has a good chance to, we would then probably pass on that player, even though, right, he probably has the football skill to help us.
I understand a lot of times in the organizations that I've run, I always looked at resources. And if we did take maybe a rectangle based on, and the potential that it could be something that we knew would blossom into just something of beauty, right? We sensed that and we believed in it. What strain on the organization in terms of resources and support? And could we provide that, right? And
Well,
I would have
here's a good. I'll tell this story. We've gone through a lot of coaching change this year. So one of the things, probably 90% of Sean's time over the last, after getting away a little bit, is right retooling his staff. So probably in the last 3 days, we had what we call our end of the season meetings, and it's interesting in those end of the season meetings. I always say the Monday through Saturday. So predominantly we play on Sundays, right? I said we weigh Monday through Saturday a lot in the end of the season meetings, right? Of like who that person is, right?
yeah.
How, how much energy do we have to spend helping that player reach his potential, or none at all, right? There's some players that, right, wow, if they all could be that player. Now juxtapose it to the draft, where, and probably just based on I would call it the mechanism of how you do that. But we know a lot about what our scouts are saying that maybe your staff at Virginia is saying about the player. And we have a gentleman that will go to their high schools, and we know what high school teachers and coaches are saying. We have psychological profiles. But it's interesting. We have that data, but because we haven't lived with that player, right, for 365 days a year, we often weigh, probably to a fault, what's going on Saturdays, in terms of how he's playing on the college football field. So it's interesting. I was just telling one of our coaches that when we do an end of the season meeting, it's like going to marriage counseling, right? Because you've now lived with someone and worked with them a lot of hours over the course of a year, where when we're preparing for the draft, it's okay, you're maybe on the dating circuit trying to figure out right who your partner for life might be. But and a lot of times in that, right, you're weighing some things. I would say that you're weighing probably what might occur Monday through, in that case, Sunday, over 365 days a year, a little bit less than maybe some other quality. So that's a long-winded answer.
No, it's good. We had a principle at Virginia to try to summarize all that, and what I was looking for was less drama, more work, which meant, just quite frankly, this physiological but also psychological makeup, to stay on task, to be able to retain information, to make good decisions, to be team first, to be unselfish. And a lot of times, and I think what we know, especially in the dating world, if we were to go to raising young people, right, tryouts are helpful. And so, like with our kids, the idea of just going to a movie, that doesn't do much for you, because you're not talking and you're just sitting side by side, and everything is right. It's climate controlled. And what are you really going to find out about somebody? And so Holly, my wife, has this cool idea for our boys. And that's right before, if they choose to get engaged, right, then there's a 10-day pack trip in the back country of Montana in the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And the girls all of us carry our own packs, right? We'll see them cold, tired, hungry, gathering firewood, catching fish, helping around the campfire or not, right? But in about a 10-day window, we think we would have given them about the greatest gift we could have, parents, as exposing themselves to in situations that are all encompassing. And so when I think about the draft, and by the way, my team always thought my boys would never get married through that tryout period. They're like, coach, they're not going to do that. And I said, yeah, the right ones will. But in thinking about the draft, I hear, or the combine, especially, a lot of times the players will come back and they'll tell me, man, that was grueling, meaning they're up early and they never quite know, like they're in lines waiting for physicals, and then there'll be interviews, and then there's the on the field component. But I think it's designed that way. And so I'm wondering from your standpoint, so you have the season evaluation, certainly. Then there's kind of the all-star game evaluation-ish period, bowl games, and then Senior Bowl, etc. Then the combine. Tell me, if you can articulate, at least for you, how all that feeds in, and is there a prioritized weight to that? Ultimately, it's a collective picture, but how do you kind of, I don't know, view each of those entities and in terms of your selection or how you assess?
Yeah, I wish we had a backpacking trip instead of probably combine it. Because going back and I'll get to the question, I think a lot of times we have someone on staff who's called development. He's probably a director of player engagement, and we actually have a club team, psychiatrist, psychology, and you have a team of people that work and help players mature. And a lot of times in the draft, two things occur. Jock McClendon is that individual, and if the staff, coaches, scouts say, you know what, Jock's going to really have to spend a lot of time with the guy, but it's like, hey, we really like this guy, but Jock's, and I'm like, you know what, we probably should pass, because I don't know if y'all know Jock's schedule, but he didn't have enough time in the day to do this. And it's also interesting, right? You'll hear a lot of times scouts, coaches say in April when you're preparing for the draft, you know what, I'll let the player move in with me. And I'm like, well, I've never seen anyone truly open the door and move in. But you're so each step of the way, and I had mentioned to Brian when we had technical difficulty with you, whether it's All-Star, whether it's Combine, whether it's Pro Days, whether it's bringing players to Thousand Oaks in Southern California, whether it's us going to do private workouts, we efficiency is very important, and we try to. Each player has probably an open file, and what are the 1 to 2 to 3 things that we really need to find out to either give a thumbs up or thumbs down on that player. So it's interesting how you weight it. And speaking of the combine, very grueling. I can give you this example, and we've as an organization, not saying we're right or wrong, have determined we're not going to go to the combine and interview players for 15 minutes back to back to back for 4 straight days. And here's one reason. If myself and Sean, our head coach, McVeigh, have to sit at a train station, probably a hotel conference room in Indianapolis, from 6 to 11 p.m., and every 15 minutes a player comes in, just based on human psychology, the players from 10 to 11, wow, they probably really got to have an energetic personality just to wake us up. Now, the interesting thing, on the other hand, as you've mentioned to your players when they come back, that player has been up probably since 5 or 6 a.m., sometimes 5 if they have what they call their drug test. And all of a sudden, he's done 20 interviews in one night, and he comes to us at 10:45 p.m., and we're all exhausted. Yep. Again, the substance of his conversation may be really quality, but maybe we're just exhausted, and there's just this negative first impression. So we've definitely seen as an organization that, holy cow, we maybe ding these 3 players for those 15 minutes, and probably weighed those 15 minutes a lot more than we should have. And those players are still playing and playing well in the NFL. And we've also seen it where, wow, in those 15 minutes, you were like, probably not a Rams culture fit.
Yeah.
But then we still ended up picking that player. And, oh, by the way, guess what? Wasn't a Rams culture fit. So we've really, that's just a long story on how you really probably, I can say this, going back to being a GM, one of the things I personally have done as a GM over the last probably especially 6 years, is really look into our processes and how to de-engineer the
Yeah.
natural biases that we have in our processes so that we can gather insightful data along the way, and no matter when we receive that data, right, somehow try to put the proper weight on it without our natural biases.
And the biases, I think it's really wise because biases exist with every one of us. And really those of us that are the most staunch saying we don't have them are usually the most
Yes.
entrenched. And,
Yes.
and remaining objective and neutral and truly open to the experience when it happens and seeing it for truly what it is it's a difficult thing to do. And like you're saying, especially when contextual things, either time, energy, effort start to wane, that does start to affect already. And a preconceived notion of someone that you really liked on film, and this is in the recruiting world as well, anything close that resembles that to one of us as a coaches or the head coach, yeah, I just want to verify that I'm good. And it almost is at the expense of everything else that's you're just looking for one hint of evidence that supports your already existing idea. And that can happen so frequently. And so in an organization and with so much time, energy, and effort spent, like in the NFL selection, yeah, I'm sure it's still not a perfect process.
And we could go all day down a rabbit hole or left or right on this as we've seen college football change. And I've often talked with let's I've often talked with, let's say, general managers of Major League Baseball. Well, they actually can draft an amateur or collegiate player, and you go right to the minor leagues.
Right.
And in the minor leagues are going to be some version of selection process. So you're
Yeah.
not really getting to the majors unless you pass the minors.
The tryout.
Let's go special forces, right? You're gonna go through basic training. You're going to be in the military, what have you, and then you're going to go, wait a minute, I want to try out to be this particular special force, and you either make it or you don't, and there's a selection process. And we have an unbelievable advantage in the NFL is college football is a great minor league, right? And the advantage would be, while we can, there's a lot of players that can come right from college football and contribute early in their career. But because the dynamics are changing in college football, where in the old days when I was playing, right, we always would laugh. It was called, okay, you got recruited, and then wow, your first day on campus, you're like, you sure they know who I am? Because I wasn't treated like that. To the point we said, we got de-recruited pretty quickly, and
Yeah.
at the end of the day, probably naturally, right, had to, as you say with the horse, you could get it, is we had to start. They were starting us, and then at
Yes.
that point, we were going to earn, right,
Yep.
whether we had a chance to help play on Saturdays. But the landscape of college football with the transfer portal and all that, it is very hard now to, let's call it, start a college football player, or if you're really old school, de-recruit, because you're constantly, continually recruiting your players. And now what we're finding is there's players that definitely have the physical skills to help us on Sundays, but boy, do they lack probably some of the, even though they may have it within them, it has not necessarily been developed or trained out of them yet to, right, be ready to play and stand from just call it an intangible maturity professional standpoint.
It's going to be really interesting, and I'm fascinated just to hear that component. And I had a chance to meet your player development staff when I was there, and it was just so fun. I really enjoyed that hour I was with them. And my guess, and it is a guess at this point, is that each NFL team, that player development component is going to end up being there's going to be more work for them. The landscape of college football, which now there are more enticements, right, to recruit your own roster, to have finances involved to keep your own roster, for players to move from one place to another because of finance. And really this idea of doing hard things for the sake of doing hard things to help the team or to become a more amazing person, it quickly turns to for what reward? And that reward is becoming increasingly financial. And so it'll be interesting for me over time in this case study to see what, if any, effect is kind of passed on to your level, and the player development component. And quite frankly, maybe the loyalty, integrity, character, resilience, and maybe some of the intangibles, and if that has an effect. And so I'm really fascinated to see if that's going to happen and manifest at whatever level.
Yeah, that it is. It's evolving, and it's evolving fast. And I have a picture of probably the sign or the wall that you had where it was, the less drama and some of
Oh
your
yeah,
principles
yeah,
and I would, and I'm sure you found out it's probably getting a lot harder to actually, right, truly live by those principles in college football. And now the neat thing is, Bronco, is I can say that if someone graduates, let's say if someone played for you and came in, we do weigh that. And let's take Virginia in itself. It's interesting about Virginia. Uh, Probably going back to George Welch
yeah,
through you, and maybe there was some times in between there, but it's interesting based on the type of kid that Virginia has to recruit
yeah,
and probably the rigors of the off field, not necessarily the on field or the footballs. There was always this element that a Virginia kid may not be a 5-star, but would be a 3-star. But boy, you could bet on that kid probably
yeah,
making it, right. And
yeah,
and a lot of times we can say that within our organizations based on the coach they played for or maybe the ecosystem that they came from.
yeah.
Now all of that is while there's disruption there.
I
You see what I mean?
understand.
Because even if you yourself, right, win, I do think there will be a win. You get back in, there will be an element, right, where okay, you have these principles on the wall, and you're going to have let's just say a class of 120. Well, maybe 35 of those players are going to leave, but that's
Yeah,
okay too, right? As long as you can bring other players in, because you're left with definitely some pillars. And what we would
yeah,
know is, even though Micah Kaiser was not a he probably was again, he might have been a 2-star NFL talent, but you know what, he carved out a probably a good career based on what mom, dad, God gave him, based on a lot of I call it the intangibles that he was probably born with, and then the ecosystem that he was
yeah.
developed in.
I love the idea that families can have ecosystems as well. And with Micah specifically, there's power in a last name. And in Micah's case, he always used to say his dad would tell him, you're a Kaiser. But that meant something to that family, right? There was a standard to uphold. There were
Yes.
behaviors that meant. There are expectations. And so whether you're a Ram, right? When you're a Ram, there are expectations, right? That says, and that kind of defines a certain level of attitudes and behaviors. If you're a Cavalier, if you play at a certain place, if the culture is strong, that helps direct, shape, and refine behavior and individuals to help them become. Now what's happening, and I know this is already a world that you live in, the finances, and for so many of these families, that's real, right? The money is needed, and I won't ever judge anyone regarding those decisions. But that's a world that you've lived in. And so how much does, because this hasn't been my world, how much does the salary cap or the finances, or when you're trying to now put together the roster or think about the financial component, how does that figure in? And what kind of influence does that have on you?
The finances in the NFL are very important, and the salary cap is very important, uh, because you're gonna, especially when you make investments.
Yeah,
And when I would say it's a very key component. Now, there's nuances to it, other than pretty simply that, okay, as Wade Phillips, I don't know if you've ever met Wade Phillips, but there's a lot of brilliant common sense in Wade, and boy, some of the one-liners he would have. But he used to always have to say, "Hey, good football players get paid good money."
yeah,
And at the end of the day, so with that being said, you're going to invest. And so if you pay good money to football players, that's going to take up, you only have so much you can spend. So it's like a
Yeah.
family budget. Uh,
Yeah.
we don't have a debt ceiling per se. Maybe you do. You can finagle the salary cap a little bit, but you're going to eventually have to pay the rent. But the important part is, number one is, if you're going to pay, let's call it your top 10 players, well, they need to be good football players and help you win on Sunday. Now, the nuances that get into that is if you do invest in a player, right, going back to some of the intangible and culture, well, intangibly, right, are they still going to be the same person once they have that money, same drive, all of those things, and also they better actually be probably an energy giver to the ecosystem,
Yes.
because
Yes.
if they're an energy drainer, but you've invested in them and you can't necessarily, or if you do move on from them, they're going to still count to your cap, and
Yeah.
you're actually, maybe they could be guaranteed money, so you could be paying cash and cap to a player that you didn't want around. And the other nuance is this: is I think it's really important in the locker room is, uh, we often say, if you pay the wrong person, the locker room
Yes.
knows it, and
Oh
they
yeah.
and now they know, okay, yeah, we understand that, and like, wait a minute, the front office, the what they paid it. So there's those team dynamics and dyads that definitely come into it from an NFL standpoint. I can know it's interesting, Bronco. I'll let you say something. I'll go.
No, I was just going to say, and wow, those decisions, right? The team knows, and if you pay, in your words, the wrong player, that credibility that a leadership or the leadership team or a coach has, that's fragile, right? You're earning that every day, right? So you're building trust over the lifetime of a relationship, but one wrong decision can damage that so quickly, right? And almost irreparably. And so there's this unique balance of continuing to build credibility through consistent and really strong choices where your team believes in you and individuals believe in you. But to your saying, man, if you pay the wrong person, right, that dynamic can shift so quickly, and credibility can be lost so subtly on one decision. And wow, is that those are the things that kind of keep a coach or a general manager, I think, you're always on because of the magnitude and impact of any of those decisions.
No, you're exactly right. And going back to what we discussed in the marriage analogy,
Yeah.
when those players, when we come to this building, this facility and locker room, yeah, I don't want to say 365 days a year, but a lot of days of the year and a lot of hours of the day,
Yes.
boy, there's something that could, even a rectangle and not a
Yes.
square, that compounds into a very large rectangle. And
Yes.
boy, when it starts compounding, it gets to Warren Buffett. You
Well,
know,
and what if your entire organization, let's say the doorways are built for squares, the hot tub is built for a square, the cold tub is built for a square, the meeting rooms are built for a square, and you bring in a rectangle, the friction, right? There's rubbing on those boundaries
yes,
24/7 that takes time, energy, and effort to manage. And when you make those choices, and I'm always considering, is this worth it? Number one, is this worth it for our organization? But is it worth it for this young person, right? Are we truly going to be able to help them be shaped and become into, I don't know, the best rectangle they could be, or more squarish than they currently are, right? And can the organization do that? And when you add money to it, maybe I'll put it this way, and I'm anxious to get your thoughts on this. I kind of did my own social study over time in the 17 years that I've been a head coach so far. And I kind of kept track. My favorite thing to do was to finally reward a young person with a scholarship that had worked so hard, right? A walk-on player that just, man, they just exemplified everything that I thought was just maybe most beneficial to eventually a family, to a society, to a workplace. And interestingly enough, in almost every case, and I don't have my notes right in front of me, in almost every case, their performance once a scholarship was awarded diminished rather than increased. And so it's interesting. Here was the striving and stretching and striving and stretching to finally be acknowledged and earn and reach this new level. And once it was there, unless another level was immediately put there for them to strive for, there became a settling effect and a lessening, which was fascinating to me. And so, man, if I awarded a scholarship but didn't immediately have another something for them to be shooting for, right? And I don't have a better word yet than settling. It was just like, wow, this isn't the same drive and energy that I've seen from this young person up to this point, which I'm wondering, I don't know, when new contracts are signed or maybe, if you see a similar effect in the professional level with that, because it caught me by surprise, because these were kids that I thought were being rewarded because of the intangibles. And interestingly enough, once the reward happened, it actually affected the intangibles, which I would have thought, how could that happen? But I started to see that and tried to then present it in a gift of, okay, now that you've hit this, wait till you do this, to give them their best chance to perpetuate, right, the same behaviors that had helped them reach that point.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and that's probably, simply put, right, some element of human nature.
Yes.
That takes place, and we see that a lot in the NFL. The interesting thing about the NFL too is there, especially with less guaranteed contracts like baseball and basketball, even though there could be a settling, there is that element of, wait a minute, to continue, right, earning this wage, and also I think the variable of having shorter careers. But we see that all the time. If I gave a really good example, I think probably haven't necessarily backed it up really yet with analytics, but we're seeing these, I call it the advent of mobile QBs that can use their legs to affect games in the NFL. Well, when you run in an NFL, there is an element of stress, drudgery, and pain that definitely comes with that. And what we have noticed is, when a QB does, let's call it, use his ability to affect the game as a six eligible running the football, when maybe that QB does get paid, runs it less, and then at that end of the day, maybe becomes a little less effective. So that's just one example.
That makes complete sense to me, and I see that, and even in the college game, when you have a quarterback that can run and is a dynamic runner, wow, is it a challenge to defend? But also, based on your succession planning at that position, when that player goes down, which usually he does at some point, wow, does that affect your team? And then the construct of how you're going to compete without that element, and the immediacy of how the burden then is shifted to the other players and their capabilities having to raise, just with the quarterback that can't run, all of a sudden you get a really clear sense of what the rest of your roster looks like.
Yes.
And wow, is that an enlightening experience?
But the human nature, it's one of the better reads, and I've never met him. You're probably closer to meeting him than I would be, but Phil Jackson, and the reason I say that is I know he spends time in Montana, if not all the time there. But based on the grueling schedule of a NBA season, and a lot of times the teams he was coaching were teams that were going to go deep, but the philosophy he had, which was really out of the box, in engineering times during the regular season.
Yes.
Where, hey, you're actually allowing human nature, like, you know what, it's almost like, give these guys a mental break, give the organization, hey, we're not even trying, we're actually trying to go to a town and let's call it getaway, and whatever happens in the gym that night doesn't really matter. But then all of a sudden you get sloppy, you get rested, rejuvenated, and then all of a sudden there's a drive again, and kind of engineering, okay, these maybe 4 games are going to be our spring break, but we're going to now come back and kind of reel it back in and have these next 7 regular season games almost be like a series of like, okay, can we win this series? So fascinating how, and it seems counterintuitive. Like, wait a minute, you're a coach, you're trying to win every game, but we also know, Bronco, that probably the human organism can't wake up every day and actually. We always say it, win the day, but like I go, you can't get an A every day, or maybe you can, but every day is not writing a thesis, right?
Yeah,
It
and
is.
it's such a fascinating concept, and I would refer to that as oscillation, right? You can't stay up here every day the whole time. There's design ups and downs, or put it this way, there are ups and downs, but I think the really skilled leader architects
Yes.
the ups and downs, which are the oscillations, and then your timing, how long each one of those is when you're at peak. When can you ease it back just a little, which is dangerous, but right, with a mature team and through education, you can do that, and then bring them back. And there are things along the way that a lot of leaders sometimes get caught up into that are just called vanity metrics, where it's by like how much you win, or things that really don't matter that sometimes make us feel good, that can derail kind of that oscillation plan, that are really challenging. And so, yeah, I think that there's, in the world of exercise physiology, there's this really cool acronym called SAID, specific adaptation to imposed demand. And so most of us, when you put us in a situation, we'll try to adapt to that. We won't go further, but we'll adapt to that, and we'll stay there until something more is asked or less, and we'll adapt to that. And so I think the masterful leader, right, orchestrates the level to be adapted to at varying points, and collectively, which, wow, is that tricky. But man, I think, to Phil Jackson and to your example, I think that's probably what direction he was headed, knowing that the sustainability of always on usually leads to a giant fall or an end sooner than later, if compared to if there was oscillation at some point.
Yeah, I think, in going back to your physiology, biology, but we've seen in sports science, right? We've adapted the, let's call it the sports science, of where okay, there's data going oscillation actually is beneficial, but when it comes to psychology, the mental part, there's less, right? There's
Yes.
less data. We don't have a load metric, so that's the I it made me thinking, we'll see if you have the courage to do this, but when and if you ever get back into college football,
I plan on coming back. So
when
I'm
I was
taking.
when I was at Auburn, I was not a starter, but I was, let's call it probably a third team type tight end, so had a role, things like. But we would always laugh when you would play what you would call, in those days it was a little more defined, less games, but okay, the cupcake game,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And it's like, why do we start the starters this game? Because they always play sloppy. They didn't want to be there anyway. And I was like, why don't they start all of us who would like probably really give it our all, and we
Yeah.
would probably blow this FCS team out instead of it being a game at half somehow, and we're still wanting to play a lot. But wait a minute, the starters still have to play because the game's too close. So I used to, again, probably it would take a lot of courage to sit your ones and twos and play your threes.
So one of the fun things in the off seasons that I enjoy the most is we would have these series of events we called super games. And so I would be basically your position of the team. I'd be a general manager, but then players on our team became head coaches of their own teams, and we had a draft, and it was a big thing. But they'd be drafting for water polo, they'd be drafting for a strongman competition, for bowling, basically anything you could compete in. They never knew what the events would be, other than I just told them it would be completely diverse. They needed a well-rounded team. And so anyway, it was fascinating to see what individuals, as soon as you put out a ball or kept score, who they became. And others were much more, this is beneath them, or, if not enough people are watching, or if it's not the semis, they're not going to compete. That were more circumstantial on what their motivation was. And man, did I learn a lot about my team just on the authenticity of a competitor, and there were some of those kids, once you kept score, it didn't really matter what you're participating in. They and their team or they and the influence on their team would kind of rise. And those are the kids I really wanted playing throughout the course of the season. Even if they weren't the best player, the impact culturally they would have by elevating the others, there's something to that, which is so much fun. And then, as Sean is probably working on now with your coaches, of the innovation to design schemes to make sure not only your best players, but your best collective of players are out there with the right linchpins holding them together, right, to deliver everybody else. And man, that's where the innovation really becomes fun, I think.
No doubt. Your story reminded me when fortunate to get a chance to meet Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great. And long story on how we were introduced, but what was neat is he had hired, man, he's got this great think tank, and he hires these young, bright people to almost spend a year with him. But he had hired a young woman that had played soccer at the University of Florida. So Kara had reached out. This is like my basically idol. And she was like, "Oh, Jim, you've never really talked to people in sports, whatever." So point being, like yourself, he came and he spent a little bit longer than you, probably 3 days here, but he came away going, okay, based on it's not necessarily the business aspect, based on the game theory aspect of it, of you have this schedule and there's going to be, right, a winner and a loser, and you have all the people in the building, right, players, coaches, and everyone supporting them. He was so fascinated by basically saying, hey, this might be the most complex and sophisticated human collaboration project there is. And again, he's been a part of a lot of, right, let's call it businesses that are just businessing, but it was the first time he'd spent time with sports, and he was just fascinating on how all the variables that, like you said, that go into basically success.
And I think the variables are so fascinating to folks, maybe from the business or outside world. But then when you see the transparency and how visible the results are, right? That combination of how many moving parts, but then here's this accountability in front of the world to see weekly, not just a quarterly report, right? This is like every week you're seeing how this holds together, and the drama that unfolds and the interplay either through injury or I don't know, maybe a relational component, or there might have been a new player added to the team, and the dynamic is, well, what just happened? It's an amazing thing. And so I just so appreciate you coming on, because the world for our listeners that Les is living in is one of the most dynamic, fascinating, volatile, rewarding, exhausting, I don't even know what other adjectives to add, and compelling, I think, jobs that there is. And it was just, I just really appreciate you coming on and sharing. It's been awesome.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you having me, for sure. It's been, I'll end it on this, and because you brought that up, and I don't know if you remember or have you seen and I'll probably get the platform right, but there was probably a Netflix series, the F1, where it covered the drivers. Well, my wife stumbled upon probably one that's now doing PGA Tour and also, let's call it, men's and women's tennis. And so I haven't seen them, but last night I normally do not like watching sports, but but watching these young women and young men, and it's not necessarily, the players that traditionally win, like Nadal and some of those, but it was those. I mean, to see I would say this, the agony of defeat, and then just the mental warfare that they had to play with themselves to get back for another tournament. But you almost want to go hug them and go, like, wait a minute, how can you reframe this? Like, you got to the semifinals as just a 30,000 foot tennis fan who really doesn't follow tennis anymore. I look at you like, okay, you're a really good tennis player, and I'm kind of somewhat envious of your life. But to see this young lady, like, let's call it be up a set 1-0, but then lose 2, and just kind of unravel. You're just like, I was telling Kara, I can't lose anymore. I feel like her. But going back to it, what you said, the visibility of right, the result on a Saturday or Sunday. In their cases, some tennis court somewhere. The how you respond to the highs and the lows over the course of to make it a career. There's definitely an art to that.
Well, there is, and ultimately too, the interplay between who you are and what you do, right? And what you do is defined by a result, and does that mean, and does that make up who you are? And that constant friction, I think, is what you're defining, which I think we all wrestle with in a world of outcome, in the world of sport. And then where are we within that, and how much are we defined by our record? And that's a unique challenge.
We discussed this a lot. That's for the next one.
That's the next one. Yeah.
I've been working with Sean a lot on that, on the telic versus the atelic. Yep. Right? Can you embrace the process versus just the results? But very hard in this, and
I think in anything. But Les, thanks so much for being on. Brian, we'll put it over to you just to close us out.
Yeah, no, terrific conversation, and certainly appreciate the time at a busy time of the year for you, Les. I know we could probably revisit this conversation and keep it going. Probably go for a couple of hours even, given the way this has trended. But we do appreciate the time, and thank you so much for joining us here on HeadCoachU.
Hey, and you know what? I'm going to do this only for y'all's sake. Randomly, our equipment manager had this helmet.
Oh, hey. Yeah.
Wyoming, so it's probably right. But point being, when he brought it in for some reason, and I was like, you know what? In honor of Bronco,
there it is,
with the horse and the starting horses, I kept the helmet in the office for no other reason. There's a symbol that means a lot more than just the Wyoming, let's call it mascot decal tattoo.
I've been in that exact same position as that cowboy on that horse, just so you know. I've been in that deal with my hand down and leaning back, and the horse going, yeah. That's a great feeling.
In this one, it looks like I can't say it looks like the Cowboy's winning, because he is. He's got his hat. It's almost like that's a 15-yard penalty in the rodeo, right? When you taunt the horse that, hey, I rode you for 8 seconds, and I can tip the cap.
You're right. Once the hat comes off and it's in your hand, you're feeling pretty good about how things are going.
So,
well, I might have to text Craig Wool and tell him that you might be going up there for Wyoming's Pro Day, just to get a look of that helmet up close in person and hang out with Bronco there. But Les, we appreciate the time, like we said, and we'll have to have this conversation maybe after the summer, maybe sometime during the summer, where you can recap a little bit of the draft class, the free agency class, everything that's going on there with the Rams. But congratulations on the season wrapping up, and best of luck moving forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.
All right, well, that is Les Snead, the GM of the Rams, and we will be right back next week for another edition of Head Coach U.